Good evening and welcome to Live United.
Sorry. I'm sorry, false start.
Yeah, I saw it. Good evening and welcome to Live United, where we have an opportunity to share stories and efforts that are going on here in the Monadnock region that make a difference in people's lives. And today I'm joined by David Tenney. David is the Director of Acute Care Services at Monadnock Family Services. Quite a mouthful, David, honestly, but an important service going on here in the Monadnock region, and I'm guessing one that people may not know a lot about unless they have an emergency. And even then, they may not know how to access that service. So give me a little bit of the history of how acute care services came about.
Okay, well, first of all, Monadnock Family Services really started about 109 years ago when Alice Batchelder formed a women's circle and addressed the needs for social services in the Keene area. And so the agency has been going for that long, and then approximately, well, in the mid-60s, President Kennedy started the Comprehensive Mental Health Act. And so around that time, Monadnock Family Services began to focus more intentionally on the mental health needs of the surrounding population. In '79, we started our first emergency services program, and I was actually the first clinician hired at that time, and we've been going strong ever since. So I'm the Director of Acute Care Services, which has two components. One is emergency services, and the other is intake. And so people that need services can call us at 357-4400 to either for phone support, 24/7 phone support, or they can call for, if they're in crisis, they can call us and be seen in the office, or we also see people and do evaluations at the emergency room.
So let's talk a little bit more about those two different services that you're providing through the acute care services. You first mentioned, well, I want to start with the intake because I'm not sure people might understand what that's providing here in the region, and if you were a person in need, you know, why you would even access that type of intake service.
Okay.
Or if you know somebody who should be accessing that service. So what does it mean by intake?
Okay, well, an intake is basically the first step for having more of an ongoing kind of care at Monadnock Family Services. So people that are struggling with some kind of mental health issue, it might be depression, it might be anxiety, it might be something more severe in terms of major mental illness and psychosis, things of that nature, but anyone who is wanting to get some help for mental health problems through our agency can call that number, and basically they would have a fairly long, intensive assessment of their basically life factors that may have contributed to their reaching the point that they have, and then after that, then there would be a case assignment. Now, we are doing pretty well at this time with seeing people fairly quickly, very quickly actually, in comparison to other places in the state. We can see people the same day for an intake, or if that's not possible, given the volume of calls, then we may see someone the next day. And this is for the intake part of acute care services. Emergency services can also see people on an immediate basis, 24/7, and we respond by phone as well, and that's another way of entering into the intake services, is you may be referred by an emergency services clinician first. You might be seen by them first and then referred for a longer, more in-depth intake.
So when a person comes in for the intake, are they then being referred to other support services, or will they immediately be connected in a way that they're receiving services fairly quickly, or is it a longer process?
Okay, so if someone's coming in for an intake specifically, not in an actual crisis where they would see emergency services. So if they're coming in more of a planful way, needing to be seen and to set up services, then I would say most people are being seen fairly quickly for a case assignment after the intake. So there'd be probably an hour and a half lengthy, thorough intake assessment, and then there'd be a case disposition afterwards where the treatment team members would talk things over in terms of who might be the best clinician to work with that person. And so, but normally we would be able to set someone up for counseling within a fairly reasonable time, whether that be, a week or longer. If someone needed to be seen right away before their actual case assignment, then they could also see emergency services.
So let's talk a little bit about emergency services, because I know we see a lot in the newspapers right now about folks ending up in the emergency room for mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and numerous things that emergency rooms weren't typically designed to take care of.
No,
And
they weren't.
so, we're challenged as a society right now with dealing with this. And, you provide emergency services, and I would guess that you probably end up in those emergency rooms sometimes doing those assessments.
Yes. Yeah, not as much as I used to when I was a more full-time clinician. I'm now more of an administrative position, but my team does see many people. There's been an increasing need over the years. When I first started back in '79, there wasn't anywhere near as much of a need, but due to economic pressures, even I would say even global pressures and environmental factors and economic people, and so and just cultural changes, social changes that are happening. There's much more of a need, and there's also been some reduced resources in recent years in terms of the money for beds, things of that nature. So you're right, Kelly. There's a lot of need and not always enough resources in New Hampshire, and that is being addressed. Yes, we would. If someone called in crisis, we could be available by phone, or if it's during hours, we may see them in our office, or we may see them at the ER for further evaluation.
So if a person was in crisis, or if you're a caretaker or a family member or a friend who is seeing someone who's in crisis, how would they handle that with you? Would they reach out and just call by phone? Do they show up at Monadnock Family Services? What's the best way for them to access this type of service?
Okay. People can always call. We're available, and speak with a clinician who would then talk over the situation learn what's happening, what the concerns are, maybe give the person calling some guidance in terms of what might be available, or referral, either to the community if it's a service that we don't particularly offer, or it would be an invitation to come in to talk in more detail in the office, or if it's an immediate need, there can be a referral right to the emergency room and further evaluation.
So in a crisis, they can reach out by phone. They can reach out by phone if they're trying to be proactive maybe a little bit because they can see a crisis brewing. And it sounds like you collaborate with other folks out there. So if Monadnock Family Services can't provide the service, you would help connect people
That's
to
right.
other services out there.
Right. We triage calls that come in, or if somebody needed an inpatient detox center, we don't have that on site. So, but we have a list of numbers and can guide people to find the right service.
So that's great. Now, can you repeat for people again that phone number? And if you have a website, can people contact over the website or find the phone number on the website?
The phone number would be on the website. It's 357-4400. But the website is not an interactive website.
And if they were to go to the Monadnock Family Services website, would they just click on the acute care services there? And that's going to take them where they need to go to see the kind of contact information they're looking for?
I think just the main telephone number would be on the
Main page,
probably the
home
main page. Right.
Okay. So, and I want to remind our audience that if you don't have access to the internet, or you're struggling to find these phone numbers, you can also call 211 or Monadnock Service Link, who will direct you and connect you to this type of service. So that's always available. All you need to remember is that you're trying to reach acute care services at Monadnock Family Services, or just reach Monadnock Family Services. So, David, you shared a little bit of the history, and you have a long history with this because you were really on the ground floor of the development of it back in '79. So tell me about some of the impact that this has on the region, having this kind of service available to people.
Okay. Well, acute care services really has been called somewhat of a safety net for the community. We serve Cheshire County, and we also serve part of Hillsborough County. Essentially, anyone who is having a need for comprehensive mental health services, or for someone who's in immediate crisis can get immediate help, actually, through emergency services. And I would say that we provide a very good service, thorough service, in terms of people that don't have any insurance or are poorly insured. You don't have to have money to have emergency services care. So, and I like it because we're fulfilling President Kennedy's vision to provide mental health services to everyone that needs it. And I think that there's a payoff for society in doing that. I think that there's some very hard social issues that people are struggling with, and so the more that people who need services can be given the services, then that's going to help the quality of life for everyone.
Can you give us an example of where somebody has reached out to you and you've been able to assist them in a way that's helped them move forward with either accessing service or maybe just dealing with that immediate crisis and kind of moving them out of that crisis?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'll change the name, of course, but for confidentiality. But there was a young man who had grown up in Keene, and he was struggling a lot with depression and anxiety. It was pretty severe at the time. He had some suicidal thoughts, and so he called the service, and we agreed to meet with him. At that time it was after hours, so we met with him at the emergency room and spoke with him, tried to basically emergency services provides brief assessments rather than the intake services. And so we met with him and talked over his situation, learned that he didn't necessarily have an immediate intention or a plan to kill himself, but he was still struggling with the thoughts that came from time to time. So we helped him to identify some self-care behaviors that he could do for himself. We felt that he could return home that night and have some support from his partner. We arranged for him to follow up with counseling services the next day with emergency services, just to check in with him, make sure he's stable, make sure he's safe, and to provide additional counseling and support. And then we continued to see him a few more times on an emergency services basis, and at the same time referred him for the intake appointment with our intake program, part of the program. And he responded quite well to the supportive counseling that emergency services was able to offer, became less suicidal. Following the intake appointment, he also was referred for some case management services, so he had some additional supports in that way through the agency. And he's doing much better. So that's the way it's supposed to work, and it often does.
And that's wonderful, because we know the need is out there. And I've been looking at some of the research, and people feel a lot of stress because of the economic environment we're in. The social environment and the lack of services is very stressful for people when they're reaching out and they're not able to achieve those. And I know your documentation even shows trends for an increased need for this type of service. So we're seeing that need, we're seeing that it can have impact. If people wanted to support this type of work, how would they go about supporting you? Because we know it's critical. We know that it's increasing, the demand for this type of service. A lot of it due to insurance companies, even, honestly, that they, people can't get the long-term care as much anymore, so they have these immediate crises that have to be dealt with. So how can people support these types of efforts?
Well, you're right. The state monies and reimbursement has fallen, I think, in it's been, I think, $1.2 million statewide of reimbursements have decreased in the past year. There's been some recent efforts to put some money back into the mental health center coffers by the state, but it's really still not adequate. We really could benefit from any kind of donations to Monadic Family Services, or people who are making out their will could also designate part of that to Monadic Family Services. That would be a great help. Donations to the United Way, we get a portion of that income as well. So those would be the primary ways that come to mind at the moment.
So people can really give that way. Now, I imagine that there's not a lot of room for volunteers in this particular service, partially because it's highly skilled.
With the emergency services and intake team, we wouldn't have volunteers. Right.
Now, you've got sort of these two branches of service, and they work together at the same time. And it sounds like you collaborate with some other partners out in the community. Can you give us an example of where you might reach out to another organization, or do you work with the schools at all?
We do collaborate with the schools, and these days, there's been a lot of news recently, where every week there's been some school shootings, and so, if a school staff is concerned about things that a student is saying or behavior that they're doing, and concerned about that person's safety or the safety of the student's peers, then they do call Monadnock Family Services for evaluations, and my crisis team is available to provide that kind of an evaluation to get a sense of how safe is it for the student to return to school. And most of the time it is, but sometimes it may not be. So we take information from the guidance counselor or the school principal and from the parent, and as well as from the student, him or herself, when we meet with them, and try to assess what the student needs to move in a more positive direction, a better direction for themselves, their own safety, and that of others. So that's one area that I think is a very valuable service that we offer. We also collaborate with other private practitioners in the community. If people are not necessarily severely mentally ill, and are wanting maybe long-term ongoing psychotherapy, we would make referrals to other therapists in the community or therapeutic groups in the community.
I know that Monadnock Family Services is doing a fairly broad spectrum of service too. You know, you've got the acute care piece that's really meeting a need when a person is in crisis.
Right.
But then you've got some really proactive things that are going on, and I think of the schools as probably a really good example. So you have the ability as a service to really get in there, do some training with faculty, prepare them for how to deal with these crisis situations. And there's numerous organizations, not just MFS, that are working with our schools to do that. And then you provide that other end of the spectrum that really rounds out the whole picture. So we have a really holistic approach to dealing with whether it's a crisis in our schools or a crisis in our community.
Right. We do also provide help in terms of disaster planning and preparedness and disaster relief efforts if some kind of a major problem came up, then in the community at large, then we would also participate in trying to help that resolve itself well.
And my guess is you probably were involved then in things like the flood that occurred here in the region, or the ice storms when they occurred in the region. Were those something that you were connected with? And because for lots of people that was a crisis situation.
Right. So yes, we would help in those kind of circumstances.
Wow, and that's another valuable service, because I think we don't think of things like that as, we think of them more as a temporary kind of crisis situation, and don't always think about the longer term mental health impact of that and the emotional impact of it. You know, a fire in your home, or the flooding, or the ice storms, people feeling socially isolated. They're all different kinds of crisis situations. So if you're a caretaker out there, or you're the friend or a family member of someone, I want to remind you that sometimes you may need to reach out that hand to assist that person in getting in touch with David and his team there at Monadnock Family Services, because sometimes people aren't in a place to be able to do that reach out on their own.
Right, and we are a 24/7 service, so there's definitely phone support service available. Those kind of emergencies do affect people and have quite an impact on them, as you said. And so sometimes it's an immediate need that we might be able to help them with in terms of referring them to some community service that might be helpful with their particular kind of need, but also we would be available to provide the emotional support and assistance on more of a psychological level to help them deal with the impact of whatever the event was.
So if you're a parent I'm a parent, so I'll ask the question.
All right.
If you're a parent and you're concerned about your child,
Yeah.
On behalf of that child, can a parent reach out to you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and many do. Some call just for information, some call for referrals, some call with a concern about their child and they're puzzled or anxious about some kind of behavior that the child might be doing. And so sometimes it's just a matter of providing some support or some coaching by phone. Excuse me. And other times we may have the parent come in and talk more fully in detail and have the child come in as well.
So that seems very important to me, because I think a lot of parents, don't know what to do when they're seeing their child, and it could be bullying, it could be that they're just seeing a behavior change at home and they're not sure what's going on. Child may seem a little down, overwhelmed with things. So it sounds like you've got a support system for the people that are trying to support people as well.
Right. So, and again, acute care services is two-pronged. We have the emergency services, then we have the intake program. So depending on what the child's need is and that we hear about from the parent, we might steer them in one direction or the other.
Now, what about if they're not a child and it's someone that you just care about? It might be a spouse, it might be a friend, it might be a neighbor. And we know that, for example, the elderly population oftentimes goes through some very emotional periods because of the social isolation or other things that may be going on, medications they may be on, they're experiencing depression. And so can you reach out on behalf of an adult who you just may be concerned about?
Yes, so anyone can call us, and depending on what the nature of the call is, we say, you mentioned elderly. If someone elderly is having some particular difficulty, we do have an elderly services team as well at Monadnock Family Services. So we may talk with that person initially by phone, or we may have them come into the office and just to talk in a supportive way, give them information, maybe some coaching, or we may decide that it's could be something, a situation that needs more immediate care, some immediate risk or danger of some type, so we might work with them more on an emergency services basis, or we may refer them for the intake assessment to determine more fully what other needs they may have on an ongoing basis. And part of that might be to begin the referral process to our elderly services program. So.
And one thing I do want to say is we're talking about when you would want to reach out to the acute care services at Monadnock Family Services. When would people not want to reach out to you and perhaps call 211 or Service Link or reach out to a different kind of service in the community?
Okay. Well, let's see. I mean, we always can give information, so we're always available to give information. So we're not going to refuse calls, first of all. But yeah, 211 is the general number, say, for someone who is homeless and wanting to know if there's a homeless bed available in the community. They can call 211.
Or fuel assistance or anything like that. I think it's interesting when we talk about mental health issues or behavioral health issues, they seem to be tied so often to any other crisis that may be going on in your life. Perhaps it's a financial crisis, housing crisis, your basic food.
That's right.
Any of those kinds of things. And so I think what David is saying to you is you can reach out to them. They're not going to turn down your phone call. They'll help connect you to the right place. regardless of what your need is. I think people have to remember that these are the people that are trained to evaluate whether you really are in need of the mental health services that they're offering, and then refer you on from there.
Emergency services is really more for the immediate crisis, more of a crisis circumstance.
Yep.
But the 211 number would be useful if people are just mainly wanting information on what service in the community provides, or what organization in the community provides what service.
Yep.
Then that's a more general number.
It's good to know that we have a safety net like this out there in the community where people can call and it is an emergency situation and there's just going to be someone on the other end who can help walk through that and get you to the right place. And this is 24/7. You've mentioned that. So I do want to remind
The phone call.
The phone call is
Support.
24/7. The intake process is not 24/7.
That's correct.
Yeah. But if a person ends up in the emergency room, or if they, you're going to
That
be
could
there.
that could be 2 a.m. One of my team will be there.
Yeah. So, we do have, what a fabulous service. I mean, when you really think about it. Now, is this something that's common in most of the mental health centers across the state or across the country? Or is this something that, here in the Monadnock region, we're just fortunate to have it here in the Monadnock region?
I would say that every region in the country has a similar service in terms of emergency services to be available for crises that arise. And so that's pretty commonly available. But I think we do a good job here, and we're in our corner of the world.
I always think that what is unique to any of our services here in the Monadnock region is how they collaborate and work with the other organizations. You're not hesitant to take that phone call and refer somebody else to another organization.
Oh, yeah.
And that you may not find everywhere. I think that does make us a little bit of a standout, unique here sometimes in the region. That there's more of an openness and a willingness to really just make sure the needs of people are being met.
Right. It's not about competing for their dollar or something like that. Emergency Services wants to help whoever needs to be helped, and same with our intake program. And we are quite ready to refer elsewhere and collaborate with other human services as needed.
If you had to say one thing, if you had one thing you wanted our audience to know, what would it be? What's your message to them?
I would say, in terms of acute care services, our program, if you're struggling with a mental health problem, and particularly if it's urgent care is available for you. So.
And that's just good to know. And again, can you highlight for people how they would reach out to you for those services?
Okay. So 357-4400 is our 24-hour number. And so that's a number to call. You could either ask directly for emergency services during the daytime, or if you're wanting to set up an intake appointment for a more thorough evaluation and to set up ongoing services of some type, then you could ask for the intake services.
I did want to ask also if people contacted law enforcement for some reason, because sometimes that's who they reach out to when they feel they're in crisis. Would law enforcement connect them to you as well?
Yes, they often do. We'll often have police referrals either to the office or to the emergency room.
So that's another way for people, if they can't, they're in that crisis mode and they can't remember the number and they can't remember the organization.
Sure.
You can always call your local police department and they're going to connect you, or they can call the 211 and they'll connect you as well to any kind of emergency service you need.
Right.
So,
Right.
well, super, David. Anything else you want our audience to know about acute care services? We've got the intake, we've got the emergency line available, and you have the resources of MFS also at your disposal, of Monadnock Family Services. So, where you can really connect them into a multitude of different programs that are available.
As a comprehensive community mental health center, we do have a number of different services that are available. We serve children, adolescents, young adults, older adults, and so that's important to remember, and that we're available very quickly.
So all ages, and I want to remind people that do not let insurance or money be a roadblock or barrier to you seeking out this service, that it's available to anyone and everyone who may be in crisis. You should just reach out because it's there, and it's supported in the community for just this reason, for those of you that may not be able to access this service otherwise.
Yep, that's the intention, is to be available for people in need when they need that help, and we do our best to provide as fast a service as possible.
So great to have you on the show, David. I want to thank you. I want to thank you, audience, for joining us, and I want to remind you that you can reach out to organizations like Monadnock Family Services when you are in need yourself, or you know someone in need. You have an opportunity to give, to advocate for folks. That's a great advocacy if you know someone that's in need, and just volunteering time when you can. Not in this particular service, but there's plenty of services that Monadnock Family Service has, and the other organizations in the community that have a need for those volunteers. So remember to live united, remember to be part of the solution, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I want to thank you, David.
Thank you,
Have a
Kelly.
good evening.